I'm Ed Magwan, and you're listening to WokeUpPH, where we talk social issues relevant to today's youth. This week, as President Rodrigo Duterte delivered his fourth State of the Nation address, we speak with Undersecretary Philip D., who is Vice President Leni chief of staff, to talk about the office of the Vice President, what they've been up to in the past 3 years, and the state of the current opposition. Usec D., welcome to WokeUpPH.
Hi, Edward. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Yes, thanks so much for being our first guest as well. We really appreciate you taking this quote-unquote chance on us because, we're just this new podcast trying to get our feet off the ground, but we're glad you made time for us, basically.
I'd like to thank you as well. Actually, this is exciting for me as well because this is my first ever appearance on any podcast of any sort.
Hopefully not the last.
Hopefully not the last, exactly. So this is an exciting experience for me too. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yes, thank you, sir, because as we know, every year the Philippine president gives their version of the State of the Nation address. But I guess this time what we would want to hear, or we would also want to see, is an alternative also of what the office of the vice president has been able to do. And with that, I want to start by asking, for VP Leni's past three plus years in office, what would you say, if you had to name one single most impactful achievement that her office has been able to accomplish, what would that be?
I think in terms of accomplishments, the most impactful contribution that Vice President Leni has made in terms of the governance landscape and also what are in relation to the important issues in the country, it's really launching her own program, anti-poverty initiative called Angat Buhay. When the Vice President won in the elections in 2016 and when she assumed office, yung kanyang marching orders to the staff was very clear. It was very clear to her that she didn't want to spend 6 years just doing ceremonial functions.
Okay.
Cutting ribbons, giving speeches, that sort of thing. She challenged us in terms of thinking of how can the office of the Vice President be transformed from a purely ceremonial office into an active agent and contributor to the most important issues that the country is facing. And unfortunately, poverty is still a big issue in the country.
Yes.
That's why when Angat Buhay was launched, it was really meant to be a supplement to the anti-poverty initiatives of the Philippine government. So when we launched Angat Buhay in 2016, and Angat Buhay was launched in October of that year, that was how we positioned the office and the program. Because as some of our listeners might know, if you look at the Constitution, the role of the Vice President is very clear and very simple. And that's really to prepare if anything happens to the President.
Yes.
Traditionally, the Vice President gets appointed to a cabinet position and therefore does some kind of mandated responsibility through that.
Which she was in the beginning.
Exactly. For the first 6 months, from July to December, she was appointed to be the secretary for the Housing and Urban Development Coordinating Council. But we all know how that story ends, right? We did get a message that she was requested to desist from attending any of the cabinet meetings moving forward. And for her, because to the Vice President, it's very clear that her number one loyalty is to the Filipino people.
Yes.
And her thinking at that time is that if she will not be allowed to attend cabinet meetings, how can she represent the concerns of her sector as housing secretary if she doesn't have that platform and opportunity? So she decided that not being allowed to join cabinet meetings and therefore give her the opportunity to present her case in terms of what's needed to be done in her particular sector, that is going to be a disservice to the people that she's trying to serve. So that didn't pan out in terms of her staying on as a cabinet secretary. But going back, be that as it may, while very limited talaga yung mandate ng Vice President, and the clearest concretization of that is that we have one of the smallest budgets in the entire bureaucracy. Majority of our budget just goes to operational expenses, so paying for our staff, making sure that we have what we need in terms of keeping up the operations of the office. We don't have regional offices. our entire staff is located in Metro Manila. So despite those limitations, through Angat Buhay, we were able to position the office as a conduit or as a bridge between communities that need assistance and organizations, mostly from the private sector, who are in a position to help address the development concerns of those localities or communities. When we launched Angat Buhay in 2016, we started with 50 communities.
Okay.
And these communities, through to the advocacy of the Vice President of going to the farthest, poorest communities, yung laylayan, yung tinatawag natin mga nasa laylayan ng lipunan. The 50 communities count among the poorest and farthest communities all over the country. But after launching in 2016 and now, we're actually in about 196 different communities now.
Oh wow, yeah.
We are able to help over 400,000 Filipino communities and families through our program, mobilizing over about 340 million worth of resources. And just to give you an idea, 340 million is almost actually half of our entire budget.
For the 6 years or for a year?
Per year.
Yeah.
So we're able to mobilize more resources and tap more resources through the help of our private sector partners to be able to do community projects on the ground. Just to give you a flavor and idea of about what types of projects we do on the ground. We have focused the Angat Buhay program in terms of 6 different advocacy areas.
Okay.
So one is housing and resettlement and post-disaster interventions. So our project there, one example project that we do there is our Angat Buhay village in Marawi.
Okay.
So after the siege broke out in May of 2017, we were involved in constructing a temporary housing village for those that had been displaced by the siege. So we were able to build that village. We were able to now turn over 72 units in total, and that's completely private funded through the help of our partners. And right now we're exploring of how we can provide livelihood support for those residents and beneficiaries that are able to occupy the Angat Buhay village. For public health, we support all sorts of programs. We've built a mental health facility, for example, in San Remio in Cebu, because San Remio actually became quite infamous after Yolanda, because after the storm and when people visited the place, they saw that some of the residents were actually caged or chained by the residents because they had violent episodes because of their mental health concerns and issues. So we're helping the very proactive local government unit in San Remio, Cebu, so that the mental health facility that we turn over is operational and properly equipped so that they can provide mental health services, community-based mental health services to the communities in San Remio. For rural development, we do a lot of work with farmers.
Okay.
One program that we do is called the Umasenso sa Pangkabuhayan. This is something that we do in Naga and nearby cities and municipalities in Naga, where we connect farmers directly to institutional markets like restaurants, hotel chains, so that the restaurants and hotel chains in Naga and nearby areas will source what they need in terms of produce directly from the farmers instead of getting from other areas because of our help. And we're able to bypass the middlemen in that regard so that the farmers will be able to extract more value from their produce in terms of what they're doing. For food security and nutrition, we do a lot of food feeding programs. And then for education, we do a lot of programs of trying to repair schools or build schools and even build school dormitories so that students who would have to travel long distances just to get to school will have the option of just staying in school instead of traveling those long distances every day. So just to give you an idea, these are some of the projects we're doing on the ground through our Angat Buhay program.
So, sir, would you say, I'm sure when you guys thought of this project to begin with, you had certain goals you had set.
Yes.
Would you say that after 3 years that you have been able to surpass your initial goals you have set for this program? Or would you say you're still on the way there?
I think it's a constant challenge for us to be able to make sure that our initiatives on the ground are impactful and are sustainable. So the challenge continues to be there. I think we have surpassed our expectations or targets in the sense that from 50 initial areas, we are now in 196 different areas.
And when you say areas, sir, are they barangays?
These
cities?
are municipalities or cities.
Okay.
So we're present in 196 different municipalities or cities all over the country, where we have some level of involvement, meaning there's a project that we're able to implement in these areas. So, but the challenge is still there in terms of making sure that aside from, and this is something that the Vice President emphasizes a lot. For the Vice President, it's important that we have clear targets and metrics for what we're doing. It's not just about output or activities. Ang binibilang natin para masabi natin na matagumpay tayo, dapat hindi lang kung ilan yung nagagawa nating proyekto, pero kung ano ba talaga yung nagiging impact ng proyekto na yun dun sa buhay ng mga taong dapat natutulungan. For example, when I cited our project in Metro Naga where we link producers, farmers, institutional buyers, for us to consider ourselves successful, the question shouldn't be how many farmers groups have we helped, but did the income of the farmers groups that we are helping improve or increase because of our intervention. And that's something that we're trying to integrate actively in the programs that we are doing, a robust monitoring and evaluation system.
Thank you, sir. I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about you have some private donors.
Yes.
How do you ensure that when these private donors give a certain amount of resources or money, that in a way they don't expect anything back, or it's not that, you know how it could be easily tainted with a government agency that when a private institution gives something, it's like wink wink, we're expecting
there's some
something
expectation of favor.
So how is your office able to manage that?
So to be very clear, they don't donate the money to the Office of the Vice President.
Okay.
They donate it directly to the community. So the value-adding role that we play is to link them up with the community, and we help them coordinate, communicate with the community so that we can identify a particular project based on the needs of that community. And then after that, we link them up and we make sure that in implementing the project, it gets implemented in the community directly. So we do the facilitation, we do the connecting, but the resources in the projects are channeled directly to the communities.
Okay, that makes sense because these communities probably don't have a lot of resources to be able to get the airtime of these big companies as well.
No, absolutely. And I think that's part of what a lot of the local government unit partners of Angat Buhay has appreciated. Because especially for these far-flung and very poor communities, the network that they can access and that they can tap to be able to augment their resources is very limited. But through the Angat Buhay program and their partnership with us, we're able to connect them to established and well-known organizations that have the resources to be able to help out. In fact, part of what we tried to do when we launched Angat Buhay first in 2016, part of the session that we did there with the 50 pilot areas, the Vice President describes it as developmental speed dating.
Okay.
So each of the local government units, the 50 local government units, had a table where they were presenting their key concerns and key challenges. And then the partners were going around to be able to see where they could match. Parang Tinder, di ba? Parang you'll see if both will swipe in the same direction, and then you'll be able to match because the community needs this, and at the same time, the partner has either funding or the project that is relevant to be able to address this particular concern. So through those initial matches, we followed up on the commitments, and then that's what we're continuing to do on a regular basis, trying to match the communities with the partners to Angat Buhay.
And with the partners, sir, it's so easy to say that these partners really just want to do some sort of good.
Yes, in fact, part of what we have realized in the course of our work is that a lot of people in organizations really want to help. But sometimes they just don't have the information on where to help or how to help. So it's the platform that Angat Buhay has created has been valuable for them, and they have appreciated it because it has given them information about concrete ways of being able to help out different communities. And I was very deliberate about saying that we're talking about both individuals and organizations.
Yes.
Because some some donors that have helped us in Angat Buhay are actually individuals or even group of individuals.
Okay.
They're a group of classmates somewhere and they wanted to help and donate to the cause. So they've partnered with us to be able to channel the resources that way.
And if some of our listeners right now want to find a way to also help with Angat Buhay, what's the best way they could reach
So
out?
the best way to reach out is email angatbuhay at ovp.com.ph.
Okay.
And there's also information both in our official Facebook pages and in our website for them to get more information about our activities and programs.
All right, sir. A question on sustainability of Angat Buhay. I guess one thing I just want to ask about that is that I guess our end goal here is to decrease the poverty rate.
That's right.
But decreasing poverty rate doesn't happen in the span
Overnight.
Yes, it doesn't happen overnight.
Absolutely.
But after 3 years, were you guys able to see maybe not, if even not significant, like maybe a small amount of decrease in our poverty rate because of the projects Angat Buhay has been able to flesh out?
So I think it's part of what we have to do is to look at it at a local level because our interventions are not national interventions or national programs. So for some of our areas, we try to track some of the development indicators, but as you yourself has pointed out, it takes some time to be able to see the impact. But that being said, part of what we've tried to do in order to ensure that the interventions are sustainable is that we supplemented our implementation of Angat Buhay with a leadership development program for the local government units. So aside from bringing projects and connecting them with partners to be able to implement the interventions, we provided a training program for the mayors and the leaders in the local government units so that they can acquire the necessary competencies and skills to be able to do program management, monitoring, evaluation, etc. And this is really a program on bridging leadership. Bridging leadership is a leadership framework where you undertake multi-stakeholder processes so that you tap more resources to be able to address your key developmental challenges. So we've implemented this together with our work in Angat Buhay so that our local government unit partners are also supported in how they operationalize governance.
And sir, these local government partners that you guys have, are these limited to members of Vice
the
President?
party?
Yes, of Vice President.
Absolutely not. In fact, we really didn't take a look at the political, their membership in any political party was not a consideration in terms of choosing whether they will be adopted communities of Angat Buhay or not. It's really about need. And it's really about access.
Okay.
So these are areas that are poor either in terms of incidence or magnitude, or areas where government presence is not typically felt or normally felt because they're so far-flung. In fact, in the schedule of the Vice President, on a regular basis, almost weekly basis, part of her schedule is to go to these different far-flung communities. And whenever the Vice President goes there or people from our office go there, it's usually an emotional experience for the residents because they oftentimes say that this is the first time that somebody as high from government has made time and effort to go see and visit us.
So it's also about making government visible and accessible.
Absolutely.
To those who don't have as much.
That's right. And especially to those who really don't feel government's presence at all. So these are the types of places that we prioritize in terms of visiting in the course of our work.
So sir, last month the Commission on Audit did some sort of a call out on this project saying that it's not clear how the office is picking these municipalities or local government offices in which they partner with. Is there any, on your end, do you feel like there's any validity to this claim of the Commission of Audit? And if there is, like, how have you guys been trying to try to fix this?
Actually, the main point in terms of the audit that was raised is that it was actually just reminding us to make sure that all the necessary documentary requirements will be submitted to fully report on the programs. Because actually, for the projects that were cited, they have until the end of this year to comply with the documentary requirements. So COA was just reminding us to make sure that we follow up on the requirements so that we will be able to comply with the deadline. So we actually welcome that because it's a reminder that that is something that we're really taking a look at in terms of being able to follow through on. And in fact, we specifically constituted a project management unit just to take a look at the projects that we're implementing as part of that program so that they can follow through on what needs to be followed through on to comply with the reminder of COA.
Okay, so it's more of a reminder.
It was just more of a reminder. In fact, when COA gave this particular reminder, it was part of that same report where they gave us the highest possible rating to any government agency, the unqualified opinion. Which means that in terms of the past, they haven't seen really anything wrong in terms of how we've operated. So this is just a reminder for us to make sure that we'll be able to follow through on the requirements.
That's interesting, sir, because when you see how the media kind of framed this sort of news, it was as if that there's something fishy going on with Angat Buhay. But then when you explain it like this, it more seems like, okay, it's just picking out like one piece of information and really taking a different angle to it.
But unfortunately, that's our experience nowadays in terms of particularly social media.
Yes.
As you may know, and as the listeners may know, the Vice President and the Office of the Vice President are favorite targets for all sorts of disinformation and fake news and other attacks online. That's why we make it a point now to make sure that we correct these things whenever we see it.
And sir, about the media and still Angat Buhay, is that I personally do not feel like the national news covers these different projects that Angat Buhay is able to do. Like from all the ones you mentioned earlier, there's maybe one or two media outlets that have talked about them, but it doesn't really make trending news.
Yes.
But in the local communities where these projects are fleshed out, did their local news cover it better?
That does happen. First of all, you're right to point out that unfortunately for a lot of what we're doing in the Office of the Vice President, it doesn't get much share of voice in terms of what's covered in traditional media and also social media to a certain extent. Unfortunately, that's a challenge for us. And unfortunately, because of that challenge, a lot of people have this wrong impression that the Vice President in the Office of the Vice President are not doing anything. We try our best to be able to report these things. If you go to our official pages, everything that we do is reported there. We try to promote it as much as we can in terms of what is covered in social media. But unfortunately and realistically, part of what we have to contend with is that, for example, if the Vice President goes to one of our project areas to inaugurate, for example, the Vice President went to San Benito in Cebu to inaugurate our mental health facility that we donated there, which is a big help for that community because they're trying to really implement a community-based mental health program. If at the sidelines of that event, a media group interviews her and asks her about a contentious issue, then that becomes the topic of the news article. And what happened in San Remio, Cebu just becomes the backdrop or the context in terms of where the Vice President said what she said about EJK or about a lot of the other contentious issues. But that being said, that's important too, because from the very start, the Vice President has been very vocal about issues that she thinks is very critical in terms of the values that we want to espouse and the principles that we want to defend as a nation. She's been very vocal about, very early on, for example, opposing the burial of the former dictator in the Libingan ng mga Bayani. She's been very vocal about the way that the war on drugs has been conducted and the allegations of extrajudicial killings. her position on that is actually quite nuanced. She agrees that illegal drugs is an important problem that we have to address in the country. But it's a question of means. It's a question of how do we address that. And for the Vice President, it's a question of addressing it as a public health concern. And making sure that we have interventions in place for community-based rehabilitation and that sort of thing. The Vice President has been very vocal about her stance in terms of defending our territorial integrity, especially in the issues related to the West Philippine Sea.
Right.
So these things are important, and they are the ones that are typically covered in media interviews. And they're important in the sense that it also reflects what kind of leader she is, and what she stands for, and what are the principles and values that are important to her. But unfortunately, that comes at the cost of getting more coverage for the good on-the-ground projects that we have had the privilege of implementing because of the generosity of our partners.
So I want to go to a point you mentioned earlier that, people do have a tendency to say that Office of the Vice President isn't doing anything, but just from, I guess, your observation and what you know about previous administration Office of the Vice Presidents, because you said earlier that technically the Vice President is just a spare wheel for if the President, for some reason, is not able to assume his role anymore. But would you say that the current Office of the Vice President has actually done way more versus previous offices of the Vice President?
I think yes and no.
Okay.
And I'll say no first because we're not comparing apples to apples.
Okay.
Unlike previous vice presidents that have all been assigned to cabinet positions, the current vice president Leni, is not assigned to any. So the previous vice presidents, because they're assigned to a cabinet position, they're able to do work because of the departments that they've been assigned to, or the assignments that they've been given to us.
There's already structure.
There's structure, there's clear mandate, they have separate resources and manpower to be able to implement what they need to be able to implement in terms of their assignment. So no in that sense. But yes also, in terms of surpassing previous vice presidents because we innovated.
Correct.
We didn't, just because in the Constitution, the mandate of the Office of the Vice President per se is limited. We didn't use that as an excuse to just not do anything or be contented with ceremonial functions like what the Vice President said. We cannot spend 6 years just going to one event after another to cut ribbons and give speeches. We have to be active and concrete contributors to the important issues that we face. And for the Vice President, that's poverty. And that's why when we innovated in terms of Angat Buhay in positioning the Office of the Vice President as an advocate for poor communities to be able to get more resources and projects for their needs, I think that is a substantive and worthwhile innovation which has not been done by previous administrations in the Office of the Vice President.
Right. So, sir, to go to your point earlier when we were talking about, you mentioned VP Leni, when her interviews, she's also very vocal about some specific social issues. Just from my observation, it seems that there's been 2 moments of, I would like to call awakening for her, at least on a political level. The first being in July 2018 when she stepped up in leading the opposition. And I would say around June 2019, right after the midterms. For both instances, what were the forces at hand that pushed her to be more vocal? Or in the first place, would you even agree to the statement I just said?
To begin with, the Vice President has always been vocal about issues that are important to her. It's not as if there was a switch that was suddenly, turned on that now I will start to be more vocal. I think if you will look at all her public pronouncements and all her speeches from the very start, she has been consistent in terms of her position and in terms of her stance on key issues. We've mentioned some of them.
Yes.
EJK, in terms of our position on the West Philippine Sea, etc. So I think it has always been there in terms of standing up and speaking up for these issues. I think part of the consideration is that for the Vice President, it's clear. Because her number one priority and her number one loyalty is to the Filipino people. She always views issues of the day in relation to that. How will this affect the situation in the day-to-day well-being of the ordinary Filipino? And that is the perspective that she takes in terms of deciding whether to speak up about certain issues or not.
So in a way, sir, it's a bit calculated, like seeing if necessarily speaking will create a positive impact or not.
Yes, and speaking when it's called for it. When matters of such import and significance are at stake. The Vice President spoke very strongly, for example, in the wake of the Cowaranto issue, when the former Chief Justice was removed from office. Because for her, it was clear, it was very important to speak and sound the alarm with regard to that, because the very fabric of our Constitution was being tested in terms of that issue. The Vice President also, and that's the same reason why the Vice President has spoken very strongly about the West Philippine Sea issue and all the excursions that we're seeing with regard to that. Because again, it's so important to make sure that our Constitution and rule of law are defended. And using her voice to be able to sound the alarm and call the attention to those issues is very important.
Right. So, sir, to that point, just last month, the Vice President has made multiple statements on Read Bank, Marawi Pride Month, but one specific issue I want to focus on are human rights violations, EJKs, which have been an issue since the beginning of the President's term. With international institutions once again calling out the Philippines, does the Vice President have action points on working with these international institutions, despite the fact that the President's team refuses to do so?
I think it was very clear from the statement of the Vice President when she was asked about this that, number one, it's very clear to her, if the government is really confident that it has nothing to hide in terms of the way that the war on drugs has been conducted, and in terms of its human rights record, then we should welcome any probe and we should welcome any investigation. In fact, we should, support it, cooperate with it, because if we have nothing to hide, this is our best way to prove it. So that's why her public pronouncements has been with regard to that, that we have to support it if it comes with it. But the second point is that unfortunately, the Vice President does not have an opportunity to be directly involved in any of these things, because a lot of these international organizations have their own processes and have their own procedures, and they would have to coordinate with the mandated government agencies to be able to do their work, whether that's the Department of Foreign Affairs, etc., as the specific mandate. So we're also, of course, we also have to be very careful in terms of how she will position herself in terms of any direct involvement with regard to these probes, because aside from giving public statements or speaking her mind about it, it's very difficult to have some kind of direct role, because we have to make sure we follow protocol and we have to follow procedures with regard to that.
So, sir, for a lot of these bigger issues, it seems that a lot of the Vice President is limited to is really making statements about these issues. Does that frustrate her to a certain level?
To a certain level, yes, but at the same time, part of what we also try to do is whatever we can implement directly or concretely as projects, we try to do it through our Angat Buhay program. So, for example, she's spoken a lot about the extrajudicial killings.
Yes.
But beyond that, we've been working with some organizations that provide psychosocial support, for example, for some of the victims of the war on drugs. And their families. We work with some organizations as well that are able to provide assistance to the orphans that have been left behind because of the war on drugs. So we try to find ways. Of course, the frustration is always there because of the limitations of what we can do. But that being said, if it's within our control or within our authority, however limited, to do something directly related to the things that we speak about, we try to do it and we try to implement it to the help of our partners.
All right. So, sir, I want to move on to a different topic. How big a roadblock were the disinformation campaigns, bullying, and even intimidation, the impeachment efforts, and the whole recount to the productivity of the office of the Vice President?
The Vice President has always reminded us and has always given us a challenge to keep our eyes on the ball, to just focus on the work that we need to do. Because there's no escaping to the fact that there will be noise everywhere. And it can be so easily distracted, we can be so easily frustrated because of all the noise that is going around.
Right.
But we try to just focus on the work that needs to be done. But part of what we realize is that I think part of the shortcoming that we have to acknowledge, and this is something that the Vice President also talks about, because at the start, our working principle is that if it's fake news, if there's no basis for what's being said, huwag na natin patulan.
Yes, that was one of her first statements.
Right, diba? Kasi wala namang basihan eh. Unfortunately, we realize that, if something, an untruth, if it keeps on being repeated, unfortunately for some people, they really latch onto it and they believe it.
Right.
So we realize that we cannot afford just dismissing or ignoring all the fake information and disinformation that is said about her in the office. So right now, there's a more conscious effort on our part. If we see something posted in social media, or if we see something that is said that is patently wrong or patently fake, we call the attention already. And that's part of the effort that we try to do in the office.
Right. And so what do you think these different groups who are, trying to give the Office of the Vice President a hard time, what do you think their goal is? Especially with most recently where they're talking about, sedition and the Office of the Vice President being part of that. What do you think the overall goal is here?
Unfortunately, the Vice President is a common target for discrediting because I think it's really because of her position on important issues that the country is facing. Like, for example, she has spoken against any form of charter change or shift to any form of government at this point because she's afraid that she shares the fear of certain sectors of society that if we tinker with the Constitution, then that might become the opportunity to extend terms and normalize a lot of these other things that we are guarding against. So because she is a thwart against the agenda of certain groups or certain people, then she becomes a natural target to be discredited and fortunately for us, despite all the misinformation and despite all the attacks, she's still enjoying majority approval and trust, as the latest survey results have shown. And because of that, she has some influence to be able to wield so that we can oppose things that we think we need to oppose. The reimposition of death penalty, for example, or even lowering the age of the minimum age of criminal responsibility. These are things that the Vice President have spoken publicly against. And because of the influence that she enjoys, she can use that to be able to oppose these things. So for people or for groups whose agenda are to push measures such as those, then naturally the Vice President becomes a target for them to discredit so that she's not able to exercise any sort of influence to be able to thwart their agenda. For the electoral protest, it's very clear whose agenda it is to discredit the Vice President, right? She is fair and square, the recognized and the acknowledged winner of the 2016 elections, and yet they continued dragging on the electoral protest because it becomes an opportunity for them to keep on sharing misinformation and fake information about the Vice President and what we're doing. That's why, as you know, the last motion that we submitted to the electoral tribunal, the last manifestation that we submitted is to resolve it already.
Which they rejected.
Which they rejected because they said that it was premature. But for us, and just to cite an example, the other camp has consistently accused us, the Robredo camp, of being the one that's delaying the proceedings. But as we've shown and as we've proven, we actually submitted a motion to resolve because for us, it's better for everyone involved if we already resolve this. But unfortunately, while we are disappointed, we of course respect the decision of the Presidential Electoral Tribunal. But we hope that this gets resolved soon because in the pilot provinces, they were not able to prove that there was any kind of recovery or cheating that took place. And because they were not able to prove anything in the course of the pilot for the entire protest, then there's no basis to continue. And that's what we're asking for in terms of the last motion or manifestation that we sent.
So to talk about the approval rating of Vice President Leni, do you think a big factor behind this, so you say it's a very good approval rating, but do you feel like this approval rating would be a lot higher had these disinformation campaigns not started, or do you think it's also quite high because the everyday Filipino who actually gets a benefit from projects like the Angat Buhay is able to really
feel the presence on the ground and really see the projects? I think all the false information and misinformation that is found online definitely has some impact in terms of how people perceive the Vice President. And because of that, it should reflect in terms of the approval and the trust ratings. So I think between that and the fact that we don't get much share of voice, as we've discussed, in terms of coverage of all the projects that we're doing on the ground, perhaps if more people knew. And that's why we're thankful for opportunities like this, because this is another opportunity for us to tell people about the work that we do in the Office of the Vice President. I think if more Filipinos knew about the projects that we're doing, I think more people would be appreciative of the Vice President and her leadership.
And so interesting, sir, because I do see a correlation that usually when disinformation campaigns spread, it usually reach those who have internet access. And Vice President Leni's, the region with her lowest, I think, approval rating is actually in NCR.
That's right, yes. And even in terms, if you take a look at the breakdown in terms of socioeconomic classes, her approval ratings are also lower comparing those social classes that would have internet access compared to those typically who wouldn't have. So there's really an impact in terms of that. That's why fighting for getting accurate information out and more exposure in terms of what we're doing in the Office of the Vice President is very important. Because you get all sorts of things in the social media. Like, for example, one thing that we have to call out is there was this meme that was going around that in the height of the water crisis, supposedly the recommendation that the Vice President made to solve the water crisis is just to enlarge our pipes. And
people believe it.
People believe these memes, especially those that don't have any other access to information or news other than the social media. So you have ridiculous claims like that unfortunately some people fall into the trap of believing. And of course, then will influence how they perceive the Vice President and their leadership.
But sir, that's a systemic problem, isn't it? Because the lack of being able to understand this type of headline news, memes, is also because of a lack of opportunity to education. So it's a cyclical problem.
Exactly, right. But hopefully that's something that we really get to address more moving forward.
Right. So I want to move on to our next topic, which is 2022 and the state of the opposition, which Vice President Leni leads. And as a leader of the opposition, what key learnings were made by the Vice President after the 2019 midterm elections? which was named the worst election performance by the opposition since the late 1930s.
Right, because not a single opposition
Right.
ever won,
Right,
right?
right.
Yes. I think looking back during the elections, we were actually quite inspired and energized by the number of volunteers that the campaign was able to
Okay.
mobilize. And while the slate lost in terms of nobody actually won in terms of the Ocho Derecho candidates, the Vice President and opposition does not see it as a complete loss because
Okay.
of the volunteers that were mobilized, and considering what they had to go up against in terms
Right.
of lack of resources, in terms of because whether we like it or not, a national campaign is really a function of resources and name.
Right, correct.
And from the very start, the Ocho Derecho, it could, the Vice President and the opposition could have chosen more popular candidates
Right.
if their only consideration was winnability.
Yes, because some of these candidates we've never heard of
Exactly.
before.
But if you take a look at their backgrounds and if you take a look at their credentials,
Mhm.
these are exactly the type of people we want to be serving as senators.
Correct.
Because they have the proper background, they have the proper education, they have the proper credentials and qualifications to be able to debate laws
Mhm.
and to be able to pass laws that will be really for the benefit of the Filipino people. So it was the choice of the
Mhm.
Vice President and opposition under her leadership to really invest in these people. And while none of them won, it's still very inspiring for us that
Mhm.
the likes of Chel Jokno, for
Right.
example, who was completely not in the national limelight at all.
Now very popular.
But still very popular, energized a lot of people,
Mhm.
was still able to have a decent result,
Correct.
even if he did not win. So in the process, also energized a lot of volunteers. So I think that is the main learning in terms of the 2019 elections. First of all, is we have to start way earlier in
Correct.
terms of preparing. Second is that we have to make sure that we keep on engaging the volunteers that were energized.
Mhm.
Because they will be the foundation
Right.
for the foundation for the engagement that we need to continue doing, preparing for 2022.
So, sir, did you actually have more volunteers for this election versus when VP Leni ran for vice president?
Yes, absolutely. And there was also a more deliberate effort to talk
Mhm.
to volunteers. So under the Liberal Party, they implemented a program called Project Makinig.
Mhm.
So this is something where they mobilize volunteers to be able to do house-to-house
Okay.
conversations about the state of the country
Mhm.
and therefore what the opposition can offer. So through that, we were able to engage a lot of volunteers, and these are volunteers that we hope we can continue to tap moving forward.
So aside from former Senator Bam and Senator Mar, we seem to have had a lot of candidates, as you've mentioned, who are new to politics during the midterms, like Chel Jokno,
Samira
Guto,
Yes.
Gilbay, and Makalintal.
That's right.
And what brought about the fresh names and faces? I know you mentioned earlier that these are the people who can debate your laws, but
Yes, right.
we've, to some level, every other previous election that the Liberal Party has run under, we know that these types of profiles were the ones that could really debate laws.
Yeah.
But why the sudden change in the choice now to field these types of candidates instead of like in previous elections where we kind of fielded these candidates way earlier?
Right. I think there was really a deliberate and serious effort to really offer to the Filipino people as options the best and the brightest of who we can be part of the slate, of who we can invite to be members of the slate. And in considering those who ended up running as Ocho Derecho candidates, it was also very clear that these are the people who have clear convictions and whose convictions are aligned to the convictions of the Vice President and the party. So these are people who are also against charter change under this administration. These are people who are against death penalty, the reimposition of the minimum age of criminal responsibility. So there's also alignment in terms of principles and values. So that was a non-negotiable.
Okay, so that was the number one.
So that was a number one consideration, that these are people who would stand up for the same principles that the Vice President and the opposition was standing up for. And then second is in terms of qualifications and credentials, as we've discussed. So those were really the main considerations in terms of choosing the candidates. Because to a certain extent, that mirrors the story of the Vice President herself.
Right.
When she ran for the Vice President, she wasn't nationally known. She started by polling at 1% in the polls in terms of preference and awareness. But those who believe that she was the right person for the job, they didn't make it a hindrance, or they didn't make it an excuse, but just because she's not winnable at the start, or she's not known, then we will treat that as an excuse not to push her, even if we really believe that she's the right person for the job.
Right.
So for the Ocho Derecho candidates, the Vice President and the opposition really believe that these are the right people for the job, for the Senate. And we, of course, despite the setbacks in terms of resources and in recall, in being able to get media exposure, we tried to maximize whatever resources and opportunities that were available to us to be able to push the candidates.
So this was, I think, a very, would you say, a deliberate attempt to shift, the personality politics we have in the Philippines.
It was a message in itself.
Principled.
Exactly. It was a message in itself that these are the people that we believe that in the principle that we should get the best and the brightest in terms of who's serving us in the Senate. And that is the alternative that was offered to the Filipino voting public during the midterm elections.
So, sir, I'm sure this question I'm about to ask, a lot of our listeners want to know, have there been any efforts to start on 2022, and whether in the aspect of, fielding or grooming candidates to maybe more civic efforts like voters registration, education, has anything been going on?
It's still very early to talk about 2022 at this point. Of course, there are efforts to be able to see how we can build on the gains of 2019 for 2022. Particularly, there's some talk in terms of how can we keep our volunteers engaged, for example, as part of the effort, including preparing for 2022. But in terms of actual candidates, etc., unfortunately, it's too early to talk about that at this point.
All right. So, sir, as a call to action, so this call to action segment of our podcast is something we keep constant and will keep constant all our episodes, because the goal of our podcast is really to mobilize the youth.
Yes.
And so, in terms of call to action, first in terms of Office of the Vice President, so doing a bit of self-assessment for the OVP, what has the recent midterms done in shifting your efforts as an office to help alleviate the situation of the Philippine masses and also promote voters' education for 2022? What direction are we headed towards this?
So in terms of voter education or involvement with the masses or the general population, part of the effort that we've started in the Office of the Vice President, it's called Ahon Laylayan Coalition.
Okay.
This is our effort to be able to touch base with different sectoral groups so that we can talk about what issues are important to them, and therefore what we can advocate in terms of policy proposals or even addressing their concerns through actual projects or concrete interventions. What do we mean by sectoral groups? These are farmers groups, urban poor communities, fisher folk, the elderly, women, indigenous peoples, etc. Sectoral groups that are also, unfortunately, traditionally marginalized or underprivileged. So we started this effort of touching base with these different sectoral groups, not just in Metro Manila, but also in key areas all over the country. And we will continue that effort because part of what we want to be able to push, part of what the Vice President wants to be able to push during the next 3 years, the next 3 years, is really the people empowerment agenda. And this is really patterned after what they did in Naga City when when the husband of the Vice President was still mayor, Secretary, former DILG Secretary Jesse Robredo. What they did in Naga City was to form a People's Council where different members of local civil society organizations and non-government organizations and people organizations were part of this council, and they were given real power to even overturn the decisions of the mayor, for example.
Right.
So they created a platform where ordinary citizens are able to participate through their representatives on issues relating to governance and to policies that are being pushed by certain organizations, by the local government unit. So by engaging the different sectoral organizations, part of the agenda is to be able to work with these organizations so that they will also be able to push the people empowerment agenda and forming people's councils in their respective areas.
Right.
So that they now will have a direct opportunity to be able to influence policies and programs of their local government unit.
Also a way to make them more basically involved and realize that their voice actually
matters.
Does matter.
Right. That your participation as a citizen in terms of nation building shouldn't just start and end by casting your vote during election time. That opportunities for active citizenship is something that can be available to you or can be present to you if there are mechanisms in place in the local government units for you to be able to participate. And the People's Council agenda is one such mechanism that can be put in place so that people can exercise their vote and can exercise their voice and influence even outside the electoral cycle.
Right. So, sir, we talk about how VP Leni leads the opposition, but in terms of the youth and who the youth really pushed for in the recent midterm elections, there was, of course, the Ocho Derecho slate, but there is also another group who a lot of the youth have also been supporting, and these are candidates of the Makabayan Bloc.
Okay.
Historically, the Makabayan Bloc and the Liberal Party don't really run together, form coalitions. And even in the most recent 2019 elections, there was no coalition formed. But a lot of youth or even individuals have supported both the Ocho Derecho slate and the Makabayan Bloc. Moving on to 2022, is that something on the table? Is that something that working together because we have the same quote unquote enemy?
Unfortunately, as I said a while ago, it's actually still very early to talk about 2022, including discussions like this of who will we ally with, what sort of coalition will be formed, but that is something that is, I'm afraid, that's being discussed here as of the moment.
Alright. And sir, lastly, after the midterm elections, we had a lot of disgruntled youth who had to face the fact that they could not simply speak out in their social media echo chambers and expect change to happen from there. What is the maximum and the minimum today's youth can undertake if they want things to change come 2022 or even before 2022?
I think minimum is they should make sure that they keep themselves informed about what's happening in the country, the important issues that we are facing, informed about what opportunities they can take advantage of to be more involved. So I think that's the minimum.
Okay.
The middle ground is to take conversations outside social media. Take it offline. Because unfortunately, social media is a bubble.
Right.
It's an echo chamber. The extent of who you can influence within social media is limited to people who likely already believe what you already believe.
Correct.
So you're not converting more people and you're not educating more people if you just stay within social media in terms of engagement. So I think in terms of medium effort is talk to your friends outside social media,
Right.
talk to people, offline, and have real conversations with people so that you can get to know where people are coming from, what their issues are, so that we can use that to our advantage in terms of how to respond. I think the maximum is for them to actively organize.
Right.
And for them to actively think of activities to engage more people, more youth, to be more involved, and to be able to really think of concrete activities and concrete engagements that they can do so that they can channel their feelings of being disgruntled into something productive by actively contributing to making our country a better place and preparing for the next elections.
Right. So thank you, Usec.
Okay, thank you
for joining us on our podcast. If you like this episode, share it with a friend. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review WokeUpPH wherever you listen to your podcast. That's all for this week. We'll see you next Wednesday for a new episode of WokeUpPH. Special thanks to our graphic designers, Az Rosales and Janina David.